find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a
Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmers.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, tell folks the title of today's episode.
Helping Couples Create Collaborative Relationships, an interview with Sharon Costanzo.
And we just finished that interview, and I always say this, don't I? Yet again, another wonderful guest. Really neat stuff to talk about.
Yep.
Her story, well, you'll find out her story, but just as a little teaser. Yeah, I mean, her story, though, she grew up in a household where it wasn't necessarily a thing especially for women to say, wait a minute, I'm not sure I like this sort of division of labor that has developed. And she found a way to work that out with her husband, not without some pain along the way. Learned a lot from it, became a coach. Anyway, a lot of interesting stuff she has to say. So do check that out. Well, before we get to that, I'm so excited. As we record this on, June 7th, 2024, my book just came out 3 days ago, and we have a picture. This is the proof. It says over here, like, not for resale. It's because this was the proof. I don't even have my author copies yet of the actual book, but this is what it looks like, except for that little gray band.
Yes, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
And I wrote a book on betrayal and forgiveness because so many of the people I work with are dealing with some kind of betrayal. It's like, I would say well over half of the folks who come to see me in the first session are talking about betrayal of one kind or another.
All
often
different types.
Infidelity, but often it's like financial stuff. It isn't always within a couple. We have a story in the book about someone who was disinherited. We have a story in the book about someone it was a woman whose brother, when she was a young woman herself, and her brother kind of ratted her out and betrayed her in that way.
Yeah, all different.
All sorts of stories.
Betrayals, siblings, parents, friends, partners.
12 different couples of various types of relationships. And, it doesn't exactly read like a novel, but one of the reviewers talked about how glad she was that I had a chapter in there saying what happened to those couples.
Yeah.
You get to see sort of the arc of their stories. And how things turned out, and pretty realistic too, because
you get personally invested in these people, and you want to know.
Yeah. And it's interesting from my point of view as a therapist, because they didn't all live happily ever after together.
Right.
That's just
as his life.
As his life.
I'm sure there's probably one couple in there, or a couple of people in there that you recognized that happened to me.
Well, yeah, and indeed, and of course, look, the folks that I have in the book are not literally the people I saw.
Right.
I changed names, identifying details to the point where some of them are sort of composites. No one will recognize themselves exactly, but lots of people will recognize situations because they're very common situations.
Yeah, there's like a couple in there that I said that could have been me.
Yeah, indeed. So anyway, I hope you will get a hold of that book. It is available in all of your favorite formats. It's available as a paperback, it's available as a Kindle, and it's available as an audiobook, which is turning out to be more popular than I expected. I don't know why I wouldn't have expected it, but that one is doing quite well too.
And there's also advice for the betrayer.
There is, yes, a whole chapter on if you're the one who did the betraying.
Yeah, because you need to get some resolution on that too.
Absolutely. So please buy that book.
Buy that book.
Not only buy it, but review it.
Yes.
Review it on Amazon. That seems to be the way. Amazon's algorithms depend on that. So I really invite people to do that. More information about that you can find at my website, brucechalmer.com. You can also, there is, I think, already a link to it on our website, ctin7.com. Those of you watching the video will see that website sort of floating up on top of my head. There is even a QR code on the video. There's a QR code which will take you right to our website, ctin7.com. And let's also talk about your book.
Oh, yes.
Which has been out now for a while.
Yeah. The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible by Laria Zilber.
Laria Zilber being the pseudonym of you. And it is a beautiful, beautiful book of erotica. And if you've never explored erotica at all, this is a great place to start. It's first of all because it's not junk, and we've seen certainly various kinds of erotica, especially in preparation for your book coming out.
Right.
We explored various kinds of erotica.
Read a lot of different stuff that was pretty trashy.
Yeah, a lot of it is just awful.
But that's
occasionally
like
though,
trashy.
some of it is really good.
We've read some good
and
stuff too.
You have created a beautifully written and very sexy. That's of course it's erotica. It's supposed to be. So it's fun to read in all the sorts of ways that erotica can be fun to read. But it's beautiful and it's biblical characters. And for those of you who are into deeply understanding biblical characters, this is an aspect that is, oddly enough, it's talked about a lot in Midrash and in a lot of Jewish sources. You just filled in a lot of the details.
I did.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you can get a hold of that book you can search for The Blue Tent Erotic Tales from the Bible. You can go to lariazilber.com. We also have a link to that on our website, ctn7.com as well. And so let's get on with our interview, and we'll see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Sharon Costanzo. Sharon is a relationship coach and host of the podcast Respected and Connected. She specializes in helping couples work through challenges as a team so they can create a more meaningful and satisfying partnership. Sharon, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on here today.
Well, we are delighted to have you. So we always like to start off asking our guests, how did you get into the work that you do? Tell us something about your own journey.
Yeah, and I feel like I always tell way more of my story than maybe most people are interested in.
But we're always interested in people.
I grew up in Utah, which for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, there's a really heavy influence from the LDS Church. So it's a conservative Christian culture. I felt like growing up, it was very apparent what was expected of boys and girls and what was expected of me as I grew up to become a woman. I definitely received those cultural influences growing up in that culture and in that church. But I also had 3 brothers. I had 2 I would say fairly feminist grandpas. They wanted all of their daughters to be educated and to be capable and independent. And so I feel like I grew up with kind of some dissonant messaging of who I was going to be when I grew up and who I was expected to be. I was also really conscientious. So I was like, I'm going to follow all the rules and do the right thing and be a good girl, trying to figure all of that out. I was also really smart, so pressured to kind of do something with my education and academically. I ended up graduating early from high school and going into engineering. And I got my master's degree in mechanical engineering when I was 22. And it was just, I felt like it was a really kind of tumultuous time for me personally, trying to figure out, okay, who am I as a woman? I didn't get married young like I expected to, just based on our culture. I got my degree in engineering and I bought a house soon after that. And it seemed like there were no dating options available to a smart, capable, independent woman. Most of the guys that I went to church with, they would hear that I was an engineer and it looked like their eyes would just glaze over like, what do I do with that? This is not the kind of woman that I was taught that I should go for. So I didn't have a whole lot of great dating experiences in my early 20s. And then I met my husband at work and it was like a breath of fresh air. Like he didn't seem intimidated by me, by my ambition or my accomplishments. He knew who I was, and he pursued me for a while before I finally decided to go out with him. And when I went out with him, I remember going back and telling my mom and my sister-in-law, like, I mean, I still get a little bit tearful when I think about it. I said, like, he talked to me like I was a person.
Wow. Yeah.
And I mean, it's so sad to me that in this culture that values families and marriage so much, we don't value like treating people as individuals. It's kind of more like a checklist. Like, is this person going to be a good husband and provider, or is this woman going to be a good housewife and mother? But I wasn't really taught, and most of the people I grew up going to church with, we weren't really taught to look at the person and say, is this somebody I really want to build a life with?
Mm-hmm.
And I also made some assumptions, because he wasn't intimidated by me and my professional accomplishments, that we would just naturally have a less traditional marriage. And that's kind of where we got stuck for a while, because I had a career, I was working, but we also were kind of trying to figure out, like, what does a partnership look like for the two of us? And I didn't really have tools for navigating that kind of conflict. My husband did grow up. I realized after we got married and we're kind of trying to figure out some of these things, that he grew up in a family where there was much more division in gender roles than what I grew up with and was used to. And so I was doing all of the housework, all of the cooking, all of the kind of, typically feminine roles, but I was also working full time. And it seemed like it was working okay until we had kids. And then I was like, ugh, this is not working. But I didn't have any skills for how to navigate and renegotiate that with him. And so I was doing what I think a lot of us naturally do when we haven't been taught anything different, which is complaining and criticizing. And it wasn't going well. And I was really mad, and he was really mad. And we just weren't working things out. I ended up, when our second child was born, I worked 30 hours a week after we had our first kid, as an engineer. And I was also having a lot of difficulty at work. I was in a very male-dominated work environment. There was kind of this perception that once you had kids, you shouldn't also have a career. And so I was kind of dealing with discrimination at work and feeling really hurt and upset about that. Our second child came a lot sooner than I expected, and I decided to quit my job and be a stay-at-home mom after our second child was born. And being home full time didn't really seem to ease my burden at all, or help me to settle what I felt like was really imbalanced in our relationship. And I ended up going back to work about when my daughter was 15 months old, and still just trying to figure all that stuff out. And we ended up having just a big kind of blow up over something that seemed really small, which is probably something that you hear often, Bruce. It's like,
I do
this is
indeed.
the last straw.
Yep.
It was the last straw.
Mhm.
And I went to my husband, and I did get to the point where I was like, okay, we've got to do something about this. And I told my husband, like, if things don't change, I just don't want to be married anymore. And I had this fantasy that, like, he would be like, oh my gosh, you're totally right. I've been such an asshole. Let me help you. And he didn't do that. He kind of pushed back and resisted, and rightfully so. I wasn't very easy and fun to live with during that time either. But we got back into couples therapy. We had seen a few therapists before that, but we got back into couples therapy and kind of smoothed things over enough. And I'm guessing you see this too. We kind of smoothed things over, but didn't really address the heart of the issue. I got busy with my part-time job, and then I decided to become a coach and help moms who wanted to have a career kind of navigate that. And as I was doing some market interviews and stuff, and I just kept coming across the same thing that I was dealing with, which was this imbalance, how unfair it is that I'm working and also managing so much on my own at home. And I told my business coach at the time, I had just like a 15-minute call with her, and I was like, I feel really insecure about being able to coach women on this issue because like trying to negotiate household responsibilities with my husband and pushing him to be more of a partner at home has almost ended my marriage. And the coach, she was a business coach, she wasn't a relationship coach, but she said, "You said push."
Mm.
Ah,
Mhm.
And that was like such a light bulb moment for me after struggling for so long to realize, oh, pushing doesn't work.
Well, it invites someone to push back.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
invites someone to push back. And
Or yield and resent it. One or the other. Yeah.
right. So I was like, oh, this isn't working. I had grown up like being pushed and responding to being pushed, by my parents, by my culture, by all of that, just responding by trying to meet expectations. That was my temperament, that was my nature, to just keep responding by trying to meet expectations instead of evaluating, is this really what I want for myself? So I didn't relate to that pushing back, more, which is probably a more natural inclination for a lot of people. And so I just realized that. And I mean, it's so interesting to kind of take some of those business principles into your relationship. Like, oh, how do I pull and invite someone into a vision of what do they want this relationship to look like? What do they want their life to look like? And how can we build like a meaningful, satisfying life together? It's kind of embarrassing to say now, but it was like a revolutionary concept to me.
It just occurred to me, Sharon, there's a association of that with the notion that I've heard people talk about when they're calling someone's attention to something like they've done something that is racist or sexist or just bothersome in some way. The difference between calling out someone and calling in. And
Oh,
it's very
yeah.
similar to what you're talking about, that if you call out someone, you're putting them in a defensive position. But if you call someone in, you're inviting them to share the problem with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I remember hearing that as well, that like calling someone in. And that was what I kind of learned to start doing. And I think so often I think when we get in some of these kind of typical gender issues in our marriage, we see our spouse as the bad guy. We kind of pit men and women against each other. And it's like, you know what? My husband, he wasn't intentionally trying to take advantage of me or trying to shirk any of his responsibilities or duties. He just had a completely different idea of what our relationship was going to look like than I did.
Mm.
And now, this was about 7 years ago that things kind of all blew up. And now we have such a different relationship than we did then. I work full time. Our kids are 8 and 9 years old. And the sharing of just responsibilities and duties it fluctuates all the time, but it's very fluid and normal for us to talk about what's going on and who's going to take care of what without that so much tension and resentment and power struggle. And I'm just so grateful that someone was able to help me see a different way in such a, non-confrontational way to like, oh, this isn't working. There's something different that I can do
Yeah.
about it. And I have had to, kind of hold my ground sometimes and be like, no, this is not what I want.
Mhm.
And advocate for myself, but not in a, like you said, not in a calling my husband out way. But hey, sometimes I even think of it as like, I think that we're better than this, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, either you're better than this or you discover you're not right for each other, which is a very sad possibility. But if it's going to work, you discover that you together are better than that. It's so interesting when you described recognizing it's not merely that that your husband wasn't intentionally shirking responsibilities. It's recognizing that he was just coming from a different frame of reference.
Oh,
And
for sure.
that's that moment of understanding. I often refer to that as the oh shit moment. It's like, oh shit, no wonder. Okay, wait a minute. You
Yeah.
already knew he's not crazy or evil. And now you've got to say, oh, that's where this is coming from. Okay, well, but I know I'm not crazy or evil either, so let's work on this.
Yeah.
I'm not happy with this, but it wasn't about accusing him or even implicitly accusing him of being a bad guy, because that's what we're going to resist.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And that sense of when you really had in your own heart a sense of he's a valid person, you're a valid person, let's work on this. That's what lets it happen. Does this sort of fit with your experience?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think also, in addition to that, one thing that comes up for me often when I think about a lot of the struggles that I've had in my relationship and that my clients have in theirs is like this conflict or this wound that we're having within our intimate relationship. There's an aspect of this that's familiar to me from my childhood.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, growing up, like there's just so much familiarity with some of the things that I've gone through with my husband. And I'm like, oh, you know what? Not only did I never learn how to set boundaries with my husband, but there's a childhood aspect of that
Mhm.
Yeah.
it wasn't just he wasn't the first person to
Mhm.
present this challenge to me. And I don't know if you address this in your work as well, but kind of I think sometimes we have this fantasy that we're going to marry the right person and they're going to make every hurt that happened in our childhood okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Of course. Yeah.
And usually it's more of like, oh, they're giving me something familiar that I can work through, and it's not really their fault that
Mhm.
I'm still struggling with, with boundaries, with learning how to advocate for myself, with learning how to say, be assertive about this is not really the way I want the next 20 years of our life to go. How can we do something differently?
Yeah, that's of course that phenomenon of whatever it is that's still unresolved, so to speak. It's funny, I sort of hesitated on that word because I don't mean to oversimplify it, but
Right.
it's going to come up in an intimate relationship because the relationship is intimate, because it's so important.
Mm-hmm.
That's the stuff that's going to come up. You don't have to invoke a sort of mystical idea that, oh, the universe gives you just what you need. You can just recognize, if I have weaknesses in there, and we all do, if I have pain that I haven't quite figured out how to manage from when I was growing up, it's going to come up in my most important relationships. And so, it almost seems like people have radar to find just what they need to stimulate in the other person to cause pain. And it's not because anybody's trying to cause pain, it's because it's so important. That stuff
Right.
is going to come up if the
Yeah, that's
weaknesses
so
are
true.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when you're working with a couple, how do you help, let's say, women advocate for greater equity in their partnership?
Yeah, I think the first, I mean, there's a few things that we kind of want to look at is I think often we just think that there's this like gold standard of what equity looks like and that everyone kind of agrees on it. And if it's not happening, that there's someone to blame for it. And and I want to like walk back and be like, no, what does this look like for you at this moment in your relationship? And how can you communicate that without assuming that your partner already knows?
Mhm. Or that
Um,
maybe without assuming that your partner is wrong or evil for not necessarily coming from that same point of view.
right, right. Like I have one couple that, one of the things that has been a sticking point for her is how finances are being handled.
Mhm.
And, she'll say to her husband, I want more transparency in our finances. And she's like frustrated because she's not getting more transparency, but he's saying, well, I'm giving you what you're asking for. Like they haven't agreed on what transparency means.
Mhm.
So I think sometimes getting a little bit more specific about how will I know when I have it? you know I remember one like moment in time that kind of was an inspiration to me. I was at a friend's house and she was a physician and her husband was in finance, so they had both had busy careers and they had three little kids, and or maybe she was pregnant with her third, but we were over there for a meal and she just looked at her husband and said, I'm feeling a little tired, I need a little more help. And he was like, cool, no problem. And I was like, oh, I wish I could do that. I wish I could do that and have there not be like any tension or resistance or pressure. So sometimes just articulating specific moments in time and how you want to handle it. I want to be able to say I'm tired and I need some help and have it not be an issue.
Yeah.
Or I want to, um, one of the fantasies that a lot of women have is I want my husband to just like notice what needs to be done and do it.
Mhm. Yes. To already know. How can I
And
not know that?
and I'm like,
Some experience.
the problem with that is the things that are important to you, he might not naturally notice.
Yeah.
Like he might not naturally see crumbs on the counter or the
Have you-
floor.
Squished raisins on the floor.
So do you have a hidden camera in our house? Is that what you're?
His standard of a clean bathroom might be different than yours.
Mhm.
So I think it's really helpful to kind of sit down and think about, okay, what is my ideal for some of these tasks? And let go of that fantasy that somebody's just going to see what needs to be done and do it. And instead, like, sit down and be like, you know what? I really feel like the bathroom being cleaned once a week isn't is a good, cadence for that. What do you think? Is that something you can get on board with? Are you willing to own that task? If that's the case, being a little bit more clear and explicit about your desires and expectations. When you do the dishes in the evening, this is kind of my routine for how I like it to be done. And part of cleaning up after dinner to me means wiping down the counters and sweeping the floor and wiping out the sink or, whatever those things are. If they're important to you, communicating that in a clear way and not getting so upset if your standard of completion is not the same, and being willing to really negotiate and talk through those finer details and letting go of that fantasy that they'll just see and do, or they'll watch you and just figure it out based on how you do it.
I've always noted, coming from the male side of that, the stereotypically male side, by the way, like, yeah, I don't notice the stuff that Judy notices. But what I've always noted with respect to those very kind of negotiations you're just talking about, is that if somebody, and the gender can work in both directions here, if either party is thinking of the other as just wrong, it doesn't go well, as opposed to just different. And there's nothing wrong with wanting what you want. But
Yeah.
it's when people want what they want with the assumption that if somebody doesn't want that, they're stupid or evil or crazy.
Yeah.
Tends not to work well, because most of us resist being characterized as stupid or evil or crazy.
Yeah.
We should resist,
Yeah.
So it's the way you were describing it so interesting, because you were just implying, well, I prefer it if these things happen, but I can understand if you don't, but I still do prefer it. So let's work on that.
Yeah.
You'll make me happy. That's another thing I've often noted with folks, and it often works well with men, because most men, not all, frankly, but most men want to make our wives happy. There is that.
Happy wife,
Happy wife, happy life. There's a reason why there isn't a corresponding one, like, besides from the fact that husband doesn't rhyme with anything. Happy wife, happy life. But that works well. But often it'll be a thing where if the wife's attitude in that is, you're a slob and a pig and you're a terrible person, and so it's not just about making me happy, it's about you have to stop being a terrible person.
Yeah.
That's not
Right.
going to work, as opposed to, you'll put a smile on my face if you do this. And most of us like putting smiles on our women's faces. And the guys who don't like that are probably not good marriage material.
Yeah.
I've met some guys like that. It's like, they don't really care about whether they
Right,
put a smile
right,
on her face.
Right.
But if from the woman's point of view, I think, and I defer to the women in the conversation here, that needs to count. Do you know what I mean? It needs to be okay. Like, if I wipe down the sink, mostly because it's making you happy, not because I would feel weird if I didn't wipe down the sink. Although by the way, I feel weird if I don't wipe down the sink, but that's another thing. We do internalize this stuff after a while. It's funny. But anyway,
Yeah.
It's like, well, I would do that just to make you happy because I like making you happy.
Mhm.
And that counted apparently because you didn't say, oh, it's terrible because you didn't want it. You just wanted it and I did it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, and I think that's such a good point, and I think that goes back to, I think, another one of our fantasies is like, well, we don't want our spouse to do something for us just because we ask. We want them to
Yeah, yeah.
want to do it like
Oh my God.
intrinsically. And we make it like this character issue
Yeah, yeah.
instead
Because we
of
want to be the
just,
mommy, we want to be the partner. We don't
Oh,
want to
of
be the
course.
mommy,
Yeah, yeah. But that gets interesting, I think, with respect to the sort of masculine feminine stuff that, the Tantra people will talk about this.
Mhm.
I mean, we all have both within us, but to the extent that most cisgendered heterosexual men are leading with the masculine and most cisgendered heterosexual women are leading with the feminine, that stuff gets interesting because I've worked with a lot of couples where the woman it's almost like she's in a double bind and it puts him in a double bind. She's saying, I want you to be the guy. I want you to lead. I want you in some ways to dominate me, except I want you to dominate me exactly the way I want it, which is an impossible, it's sort of impossible, but when they can play with that,
Yeah.
it works fine. When it's a grudge match, it doesn't work
Well,
well
it
at
kind of
all.
ties into the next question I was going to ask you, Sharon, because you talked about that many women make particular mistakes when they're trying to improve their relationship with their spouses. So what can you elaborate on what those mistakes are?
yes, I think the number one mistake, and I was definitely guilty of this, but it comes up in nearly every single couple that I work with, is when the progress doesn't happen fast enough. You
Mm.
know, I hear so often from women like, there's some sort of blow up. I just can't take this anymore. You need to step up and either, put more effort into the emotional side of our relationship and pursuing, connection, or do more housework or childcare. And there's more effort done, but it doesn't last.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that Terry Real says often is like, celebrate the glass being 15% full.
Uh-huh.
The best way to get more of what you want is to appreciate what you have. And I know that when I was feeling like completely depleted and resentful and like it was too little too late, then my husband was like, why even try?
Mhm.
Mhm.
She's never going to be happy. She's never going to be satisfied. And so I think it's really helpful to think of this as like we're making small incremental improvements to our relationship. And all of this resentment that I have from everything that hasn't been done in the past, I've got to kind of put that aside and look at my husband or my spouse and say, I really appreciate that you're making an effort,
Mm.
you
It's,
know?
that is a very common phenomenon, I think, in lots of different aspects, in this one, but also in kind of related things. When things start to get a little better, I remember learning, decades ago, I remember learning some statistic I had to learn for the psychology licensing exam
Mhm.
that said the most dangerous time for suicide isn't when somebody's in the depth of their depression. It's when they start to come out of it. And you can look at that as a couple as well. The most dangerous time for a couple isn't necessarily when they're at that point of saying, they're just depressed about it. It's when it starts to get a little better, but not fast enough. Because then you start seeing some signs, oh, you mean change is possible? And I've heard from so many, especially from women, the guy will start to get a clue that
Mhm.
he's kind of been a jerk. And so he starts to get a clue he's been a jerk and expects her to be grateful that he's now less of a jerk. And instead, she's thinking, I've been telling you this for umpteen years to stop being such a jerk. You go to a therapist, you see the light and you start being less of a jerk. And now you expect me to be grateful as opposed to massively pissed off. And often she's massively pissed off. And I kind of warn both parties about that. It's a natural reaction. It's like, I've been telling you this for years, and now all of a sudden you're doing it. You can't just get over that pain instantly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think on the, like, in this stereotypical situation that we're talking about, it is really common for the men to be like, why isn't she, singing my praises and forgiving me and getting over it already. And I think there needs to be, like you said, patience on both sides.
Mhm.
Like, yes, I am getting it and I am putting in more effort. And my spouse may not be acknowledging and appreciating it as much as I would like, and have some patience with that. So we both can kind of acknowledge our part of that pattern and appreciate more, but also have more patience with the person who's been feeling hurt and kind of neglected for
Yeah.
so long.
Yeah, and that ends up, it's always fascinating to me. I just wrote a book on betrayal and forgiveness. And one of the things in healing from a betrayal, you don't want to be in a situation, even when both parties have acknowledged, let's say the guy cheats and the woman was cheated on, or it could be the other way around, but let's say that, where you don't want to have a situation where the healing looks like the guy is permanently the villain and constantly has to prove his worth, and the woman is permanently the offended party and constantly has to monitor him. That doesn't work well. They both have to be restored to a sense of dignity and honor and validity.
Mhm.
And that's true even in things like, wow, for the guy to discover, takes a while to penetrate his consciousness, but she finally gets pissed off enough that he has to recognize, oh my God, she really means it. This isn't going to work if I don't turn things around. He's going to have to forgive himself as well as her. And she's going to have to forgive herself as well as him. And then they can both be restored to that sense of validity. There's reasons why we get to be the way we are, even if we don't understand all the reasons. And
Oh,
if we
for
start
sure.
from that basic sense of validity, that which is what I call faith, basically. If we base it, we're all valid people. We're doing the best we can. We just need to learn better so that we can do better.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important to kind of think of it as like, have we kind of created enough like safety and stability in this relationship that we can trust and be vulnerable? Because I think forgiveness is a vulnerable thing. Appreciating someone who hasn't given us everything that we've asked for, there's some vulnerability in that. I think it's really helpful to acknowledge like how vulnerable. I like how you say faith, how vulnerable it is to choose to trust someone
Absolutely.
who who
Yeah.
may or may not like be able to fulfill everything that we're asking for.
Well, and because it turns out we're all human beings, that when you trust someone, occasionally they will fail to live up to every expectation you have. I'm not
Yeah.
talking about big betrayals necessarily, but we're all off a little sometimes. We're all not going
Yeah.
to are playing our best game all the time. And so
Yeah.
that it is very vulnerable to put your heart in someone else's hands and realize, knowing full well that occasionally they're going to bruise it a little bit.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Comes with the territory.
Yeah.
So, what would you like men to know about collaborative relationships?
I think that's such an interesting question. I don't know if anybody's ever asked me that specifically before, but I think that, um, hmm, I think that out in the world, so often men are in such a competitive frame of mind that being like at the top, being in charge is such an important part of their identity. And so coming into a relationship with a woman and really collaborating with her, there's a certain vulnerability and trust in that,
Oh yeah.
that being collaborative with your intimate partner is not a loss.
Hmm.
It's not um you don't have to put yourself in the one down position to be collaborative. I think so often we think of we're either one up or we're one down.
Hmm.
And what does it look like to look at your spouse as an equal and not slip into that? I think so often when men try and be more collaborative with their wives and they're first learning how to do it, it's very easy for them to slip into that one down position.
Oh
What
yeah.
can I do to make you happy? And I do see this sometimes with my clients, he finally wakes up to, oh, I've been a little bit selfish and entitled in this relationship. And now it's time for me to just, whatever my wife says goes. And I'm just going to be scrambling to try and anticipate and meet her needs. And that doesn't really work out very well either.
No, no, I just have a couple I've worked with recently where that was sort of, it was so interesting. The woman finally realized, and this is her description, she would go into full-fledged bitch mode, as she would put it. I wouldn't typically coin that term myself.
Yeah.
And what she wanted from her husband, and he was so accommodating to everything, it was driving her nuts. She wanted him to say, first of all, I don't want to be talked to that way. She wanted him to say that.
Yeah.
And she wanted him to do what she wanted him to do, but she also wanted him to say, no, I don't agree with you. You know,
Yeah.
she's looking for him to stand up, and yeah, which is a way of being collaborative. It's like, don't just do everything I say. Then, interestingly enough, you can feel freer to say what you want when you have confidence that the other person will disagree if they want to.
Yeah, but that's really
Yes.
confidence from, you have to feel validated to get that confidence.
Absolutely. And that's what she recognized, that she had been training him to be afraid of her.
Ah.
But of course, he being a guy, I know this one. I mean, we're not going to admit we're afraid. Although we are quaking in our boots, we're just not willing to admit
Well,
it.
because you're saying, what does she want? I just can't satisfy her.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And besides, she keeps hurting me.
Yeah.
That's the thing. We're not allowed to say that. I was reminded of, Sharon, when you were talking about that notion of men being competitive, is Deborah Tannen's book from like 30 years ago. You Just Don't Understand. I think that's what it's called. Men and Women Conversation. I think she's a psycholinguist or something like that, or psychologist who specializes in studying languages. And she talked about that very thing, that when men are talking to men, what we're worried about, mostly is, are we one up or one down? When I'm talking to another man, I suppose from that standpoint, I don't have ill will, usually. I don't have ill will toward the other guy. I don't want him to lose, but I'm damned if I'm going to lose. It's about winning and losing. And we want to make sure that that's not what's happening. And of course, what Deborah Tannen talked about with women, and again, I defer to the women in the room, that women, it's much more complex. It's much more about what's our relationship? How are we doing? I'm not saying women are nicer.
Yeah.
Right? Necessarily, but it's all about, how do we feel about each other? How do we feel about this person we're talking about? What's our relationship to our respective spouses and our respective communities?
Yeah.
All of that is happening. And for men, it's just about, am I winning or losing? And so men talking to women, it's amazing we can ever have a conversation. Because there's, and it does show up in that area of, okay, I want to make her happy, which is to say, I don't want to lose. But if I do it to make her happy, she says it doesn't count. What am I supposed to do now? So it's tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we talked about, I do a monthly couples call, and it's just a small group, and it was really interesting because we were talking about, giving feedback and making requests, and one of the points was, when you're kind of making this negotiation and your spouse comes to you with a request, acknowledge the request and give what you can without resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's such an important principle for both men and women to learn, but men especially, like, yes, I can help with household chores, but I'm going to feel resentful if I'm held to this standard of a pristine house.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's one thing that I reflect on, looking at, I kind of was celebrating the fact that my husband and I have such a better partnership now than we did before, but our house is dirtier than it used to be.
Well, and that was, I mean, given who you are and your husband is, apparently, because there are some husbands that are the neat freaks, so
Yes,
you never know.
yeah.
Yeah.
But given, that was bound to happen, and you had to be willing to accept that.
Yeah.
And it's always the person with the more exacting standard, which is not always the woman, but whatever.
Right.
It's always the person with the more exacting standard who's going to be the one who's going to feel like it's not quite up to my standard.
Yeah.
Men,
Mhm.
Yeah. And I did grow up in a home where my dad was the one with the exacting standard, but
Yeah.
he wasn't the one maintaining that standard. And I still remember when I was like 15 years old and he made a comment, and I'm sure, he's grown since then too. This was 25 years ago. He made some comment of like, if you guys cared about me, you'd keep the house clean. And I was like, I think that's bullshit, Dad. I was old enough to realize I don't agree with that. And for whatever reason, I was the only kid in the house that was able to say, you know what, I think this is bullshit. Like,
It's impressive you could say that, right?
I
So
didn't
it
use
does
those
say,
words. I wasn't allowed to use those words, but I was like, no, this is messed up. Like,
uh-huh. Well, there's the very fact that you could offer that opinion kind of fits with what you were saying earlier about you might have been in a very sort of traditional conservative household, but they clearly allowed for a young woman as you were to say, to speak your mind.
yeah. Yeah, it
Otherwise,
was definitely even though I was very conscientious about following the rules and stuff, I also had that little streak of feistiness as well.
indeed.
Yeah.
Well, how can folks get in touch with you if they want to, if they want to use you as a coach or just learn more?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you go to my website, it's respectedandconnected.com, just spelled out all of the words, respectedandconnected.com. You can schedule a free consult with me there. And
Mhm.
then also you can see, like I mentioned before, we do a monthly couples call. It's very, just a very great community to have some of these conversations with other couples. That information's on the website as well. And then I'm also on Instagram. My handle is respected and connected, but it's respected underscore the word and underscore connected. So those are the two best places to find me, I'd say.
Great. And of course, your podcast is available.
Yes, my respected and connected podcast as well. Thanks for adding that.
Sure.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, it's been great to chat with you guys today.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that interview with Sharon Costanzo. And again, her wait a second.
Respected and connected.
Respected and connected.
Yeah.
Her website and her podcast.
Yes, indeed. Which, by the way, I'm going to be, though she wasn't sure exactly when the episode will be on, but I recorded an episode on her podcast as well. I was a guest on her podcast.
That's right.
As well. Want to mention for folks in the Vermont area, Vermont and Northern New York area, I'm going to be interviewed on Channel 3, WCAX TV, talking about my new book, Betrayal and Forgiveness. And so I don't know exactly when that's going to be on, but do watch for that, or you can probably search the WCAX TV website. There'll be an interview with me talking about that book as well.
Yeah. And we, in our intro, we didn't talk about your other two books.
We didn't talk about my other two books, which are still out there and
They are
still available.
Out there, yes.
And so let's mention those as well.
Yeah, let's talk about them. We have Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. And It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
Indeed. And, Reigniting the Spark is, as the name implies, it's really all about making your relationship better in lots of ways and covers a lot of the ideas that kind of gave rise to our podcast and the Couples Therapy in 7 Words. That book, Reigniting the Spark, is organized around the 7 words. It has a section on be kind, a section on don't panic, and a section on and have faith. Got to have and to get the 7 words. And have faith. And then a section on now go and learn, which is to say, let's apply those ideas to various situations. The second book, It's Not About Communication. If you have any interest in how does this whole therapy thing work, that book is all about that. It really helps you be a better consumer of therapy. If you're a therapist yourself, I invite you to check that out. I have a chapter in there called Couples Therapy Under the Hood, which tells you how I think about first sessions and how that sort of lays the groundwork for therapy to follow.
And of course, you can visit our website, CTN7, for all of this information, ctn7.com. And you can also get all the latest news on Bruce's books at the website. And you can, the latest news, you can get his newsletter. So you can subscribe to Bruce's newsletter.
You can do that
at ctn7.com.
And another thing you can do at ctn7.com, which is you can send us a message. And what might you put in that message? Well, first of all, any feedback. We always love to hear from folks.
Feedback is good.
And also any suggestions for topics, for guests, including yourself. If you want to suggest yourself as a guest, we're always happy to get those suggestions. And any other thing, I recently have invited this. We haven't got on it yet, but I invite folks, if you want to record some feedback, either audio or video, we might include it in one of our podcasts. So please feel free to do that as well. You can do all that through our website, ctn7.com. And so until next time,
Remember, be kind
don't panic.
and have faith.